Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 13 of our complete practice question series for the SAA-C03 AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends. Then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 13. Question number 428. A security standard prohibits any security group from allowing TCP port 22 from 0.0.0.0/0. The security team needs rapid notification whenever an existing or newly changed security group violates the rule. The company prefers a managed control that can be deployed immediately. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Create a role that can open security groups and alert whenever the role is assumed. Option B. Use an SCP to require administrator approval for all security group changes and rely on ticket notifications. Option C. Enable the AWS Config Managed Rule Restricted SSH and publish non-compliance notifications through Amazon SNS. Option D. Develop a Lambda function that periodically enumerates every security group and sends custom alerts. The correct answer is C. Enable the AWS Config Managed Rule Restricted SSH and publish non-compliance notifications through Amazon SNS. Here's why. The AWS Config Restricted SSH Managed Rule evaluates whether SSH is open to the Internet. Compliance change notifications can be sent through Amazon SNS without maintaining custom evaluation code. Why are the other options not correct? A. Role assumption monitoring does not evaluate the actual rules in every security group. B. An approval workflow does not detect all existing or externally created violations. D. Custom Lambda polling duplicates a managed AWS config rule and adds code and scheduling overhead. Exam tip. Prefer AWS config managed rules when a required configuration check already exists. Question number 429. An enterprise is separating its microservices into team-owned AWS accounts. Services run on AWS Lambda and Amazon EKS, and consumers reside in many VPCs. The platform must provide HTTPS service-to-service connectivity and a central service registry without requiring teams to maintain a mesh of VPC routes and endpoints. Which design provides the least administrative overhead? Option A. Connect every service VPC with peering, maintain prefix lists and routes, and restrict traffic with security groups. Option B. Create an NLB and a private link endpoint service for every microservice, then create consumer endpoints in each VPC. Option C. Route all inter-VPC traffic through a transit gateway and an AWS Network Firewall Inspection VPC. Option D. Create an Amazon VPC Lattice Service Network, register the Lambda and EKS targets, configure HTTPS listeners, and associate the required VPCs. The correct answer is D. Create an Amazon VPC Lattice Service Network, register the Lambda and EKS targets, configure HTTPS listeners, and associate the required VPCs. Here's why. VPC Lattice supplies a managed service network, service discovery, listeners, and target registration for supported compute across VPCs and accounts. It avoids per-service endpoint infrastructure and full mesh routing. Why are the other options not correct? A. Full mesh peering and route maintenance become difficult to operate as accounts and services grow. B. A separate NLB, endpoint service, and consumer endpoint for every service creates substantial administration. C. Central inspection controls traffic but does not provide the required application service registry. Exam tip. Use VPC Lattice for managed cross-VPC service connectivity and discovery. Question number 430. A gaming API reads frequently requested catalog metadata from Amazon RDS. Increasing the database instance size has not removed read latency. The new caching layer must deliver sub-millisecond responses and support both replication and recoverable snapshots. What should the solutions architect add? Option A. Migrate the catalog to DynamoDB global tables. Option B. Place Amazon Elastic Cache for RedISS in front of the RDS database. Option C. Add Amazon Elastic Cache for Memcached as the shared cache. Option D. Move the database to Aurora and add Aurora replicas. The correct answer is B. Place Amazon Elastic Cache for RedISS in front of the RDS database. Here's why. Elastic Cache for RedISS provides in-memory sub-millisecond access and supports replication and snapshots. It can offload repetitive metadata reads while preserving RDS as the system of record. Why are the other options not correct? A. DynamoDB global tables require a database redesign and do not provide the requested cache snapshot behavior. C. Memcached offers fast caching but lacks native replication and persistent snapshots. D. Aurora replicas scale database reads but do not provide the requested sub-millisecond cache layer. Exam tip. Select RedISS rather than Memcached when the cache also needs replication and snapshots. Question number 431. A central security account produces approved AMIs for an AWS organization's environment. The images are backed by snapshots encrypted with customer-managed KMS keys. Every present and future account in the engineering OU must be able to launch the images without sharing them with unrelated OUs. Which two actions are required? Option A. Grant AMI launch permissions separately to every current engineering account. Option B. Add the engineering OU ARN to the AMI launch permissions. Option C. Share each AMI with the organization root. Option D. Replace the existing KMS keys and grant the organization root access to the new keys. E. Update the KMS key policies so principals in the engineering OU can use the keys for the encrypted snapshots. The correct answer is B. Add the engineering OU ARN to the AMI launch permissions. E. Update the KMS key policies so principals in the engineering OU can use the keys for the encrypted snapshots. Here's why. Sharing AMI launch permission with the engineering OU automatically includes current and future member accounts. Because the snapshots are encrypted, the KMS key policies must also authorize principals in that OU to use the keys. Why are the other options not correct? A. Per-account sharing requires ongoing updates whenever engineering accounts are added or removed. C. Sharing with the organization root exposes the AMIs beyond the intended OU. D. The existing customer-managed keys can be updated. Recreating them and granting the root is unnecessary and overly broad. Exam tip. Encrypted AMI sharing requires both launch permission and permission to use the snapshot encryption key. Question number 432. A research consortium must move 80 PB from 80 international sites to Amazon S3 within 4 weeks. Each site contains about 1 PB and has only 1 to 2 gigabits per second of internet bandwidth. The consortium was already an AWS Snowball Edge customer before the service's availability change and can still order devices. Which approach is most cost-effective for this one-time migration? Option A. Install a new 10 gigabits per second direct connect circuit at every site. Option B. Stream the data through volume gateway appliances over each site's existing internet connection. Option C. Use multiple Snowball Edge storage optimized devices in parallel at the sites and import the returned devices into Amazon S3. Option D. Send one snowmobile to collect data sequentially from all 80 locations. The correct answer is C. Use multiple Snowball Edge storage optimized devices in parallel at the sites and import the returned devices into Amazon S3. Here's why. For an existing eligible customer, multiple Snowball Edge devices can operate in parallel across the distributed sites and avoid both the long lead time of many dedicated circuits and the bandwidth limits of online transfer. Why are the other options not correct? A. Provisioning 80 new high-capacity circuits is expensive and unlikely to meet the 4-week deadline. B. The available internet bandwidth is insufficient for transferring 80 PB in the required period. D. A single truck-based transfer workflow is unsuitable for many geographically dispersed sites, and Snowmobile is no longer available. Exam tip. For very large distributed offline migrations, parallel physical transfer devices can overcome limited WAN capacity. Question number 433. Several EC2-based analytics applications mount a shared Amazon EFS dataset. The applications may read the reference files, but must be prevented through IAM authorization from modifying or deleting them. Which control satisfies the requirement? Option A. Attach an EFS file system policy that explicitly denies Elastic File System client right to the EC2 instance roles while allowing the required mount access. Option B. Mount the file system with a read-only client option on each EC2 instance. Option C. Create an identity policy on the EFS file system resource that denies client right. Option D. Use EFS access points and rely only on POSIX mode bits to make the root directories read-only. The correct answer is A. Attach an EFS file system policy that explicitly denies Elastic File System client right to the EC2 instance roles while allowing the required mount access. Here's why. An EFS resource-based file system policy can explicitly deny the client right action for the application roles while still permitting client mount. The restriction is therefore enforced through IAM authorization. Why are the other options not correct? B. A read-only mount is a client-side setting and does not meet the stated IAM enforcement requirement. C. Identity policies are attached to IAM identities, not to an EFS file system resource. D. POSIX permissions can restrict rights, but do not implement the requested IAM control. Exam tip. With EFS IAM authorization, client mount enables mounting and client right controls right operations. Question number 434. A compliance vendor operates an automation service from the vendor's own AWS account. The service needs limited access to resources in a customer's AWS account, and the customer does not want to issue long-term credentials. Which solution is most secure? Option A. Create an IAM user in the customer account and apply a permissions boundary that references the vendor account. Option B. Create an IAM group in the customer account and add the vendor's cross-account principal to the group. Option C. Create an IAM user with a strong console password and attach the required permissions. Option D. Create a least privilege IAM role in the customer account whose trust policy allows the vendor's IAM role to assume it. The correct answer is D. Create a least privilege IAM role in the customer account whose trust policy allows the vendor's IAM role to assume it. Here's why. A cross-account role lets the customer define both trust and least privilege permissions. The vendor assumes the role through AWS STS and receives temporary credentials instead of credentials owned by the customer account. Why are the other options not correct? A. A permissions boundary does not establish cross-account trust, and the IAM user would still require long-term credentials. B. IAM groups cannot contain users or roles from another AWS account. C. An IAM user creates persistent credentials and is less secure than role assumption. Exam tip. Grant third parties cross-account access with a trusted IAM role and temporary STS credentials. Question number 435. A company allows several departments to run proof-of-concept workloads in one AWS environment. Finance must attribute costs to the responsible department and alert the CFO when a department reaches 60% of its approved spending limit. Which solution meets both requirements? Option A. Use Cost Explorer forecasts to infer ownership and configure a cost budget for each forecast. Option B. Activate department cost allocation tags and create AWS budgets cost budgets filtered by those tags with a 60% alert threshold. Option C. Tag resources by department and use Trusted Advisor through the AWS Support API to send threshold alerts. Option D. Use cost anomaly detection to identify the department and alert whenever spending is 60% above normal. The correct answer is B. Activate department cost allocation tags and create AWS budgets cost budgets filtered by those tags with a 60% alert threshold. Here's why. Activated cost allocation tags provide departmental attribution. AWS budgets can filter a cost budget by those tags and notify stakeholders when actual or forecasted spend reaches the configured percentage. Why are the other options not correct? A. Cost Explorer does not infer resource ownership without allocation metadata. C. Trusted Advisor does not provide fixed departmental budget percentage alerts. D. Anomaly detection identifies unusual patterns rather than enforcing a predefined 60% budget threshold. Exam tip. Use cost allocation tags for ownership and AWS budgets for fixed spending thresholds. Question number 436. An internal HR application will run on EC2 and must be reachable only from a corporate network connected to the VPC by site-to-site VPN. The instances also need outbound internet access to download operating system updates, but they must not accept internet-initiated connections. Which architecture meets these requirements? Option A. Place the instances in public subnets behind an internet-facing ALB that permits 0.0.0.0/0. Option B. Place the instances in private subnets behind an internet-facing ALB and provide no NAT path. Option C. Place the instances in private subnets behind an internal ALB. Allow the office CIDR on the ALB security group and route outbound traffic through NAT gateways in public subnets. Option D. Place the instances in public subnets behind an internal ALB and deploy NAT gateways in private subnets. The correct answer is C. Place the instances in private subnets behind an internal ALB. Allow the office CIDR on the ALB security group and route outbound traffic through NAT gateways in public subnets. Here's why. The internal ALB is reachable through the VPN and can restrict inbound requests to the corporate CIDR. Private instances use public subnet NAT gateways for initiated outbound patch traffic without becoming publicly reachable. Why are the other options not correct? A. The public load balancer and open source range expose the application to the internet. B. An internet-facing ALB violates the private access requirement, and the instances lack the required egress path. D. The instances should remain private, and NAT gateways require public subnets with a route to an internet gateway. Exam tip. Combine an internal load balancer for private ingress with NAT for private subnet internet egress. Question number 437. A financial application needs a current AWS managed database design for transaction records. The design must preserve an append-only history, support independent verification that prior records were not altered, and minimize database administration. Which option is the best current provisional architecture? Option A. Load the records into Amazon Redshift and retain regular snapshots. Option B. Store relationships in Amazon Neptune and use graph history queries. Option C. Use Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL with append-only journal tables, a cryptographic hash chain, and immutable digest checkpoints stored in an S3 bucket with object lock. Option D. Write the records to Amazon TimeStream and use retention policies as the audit mechanism. The correct answer is C. Use Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL with append-only journal tables, a cryptographic hash chain, and immutable digest checkpoints stored in an S3 bucket with object lock. Here's why. Amazon QLDB is no longer available. A managed Aurora PostgreSQL database combined with an application-enforced append-only journal, cryptographic chaining, and immutable external digest checkpoints is a current way to approximate verifiable ledger behavior while reducing infrastructure administration. Why are the other options not correct? A. Redshift is an analytics warehouse and snapshots do not provide a cryptographically verifiable transaction journal. B. Neptune is optimized for graph relationships and does not supply ledger semantics. D. TimeStream is a time series database. Retention policies do not make records cryptographically verifiable. Exam tip. When a retired purpose-built service has no direct replacement, separate managed data storage from explicit immutability and verification controls. Question number 438. A reporting pipeline receives raw campaign files in Amazon S3. Several managed preparation jobs must run on a schedule in parallel, after which selected jobs must execute in a defined sequence. The company does not want to build retry handling, state tracking, or error recovery. Which solution best meets the requirement? Option A. Create AWS Glue Databrew jobs and orchestrate their parallel and sequential execution with AWS step functions. Option B. Invoke independent Lambda functions from S3 and use custom code to coordinate later steps. Option C. Run SQL and Athena on a schedule and use query completion events as the entire workflow engine. Option D. Create one nightly AWS data pipeline job that executes every transformation serially. The correct answer is A. Create AWS Glue Databrew jobs and orchestrate their parallel and sequential execution with AWS step functions. Here's why. Databrew provides managed data preparation jobs, and step functions models parallel branches, order dependencies, retries, failures, and state without custom orchestration code. Why are the other options not correct? B. Direct Lambda invocation leaves sequencing, retries, and workflow state to custom code. C. Athena performs SQL analysis but does not by itself provide the required preparation workflow and dependency management. D. A single serial nightly pipeline does not meet the parallel and later sequenced execution pattern. Exam tip. Use step functions when managed tasks require parallelism, sequencing, retries, and durable state. Question number 439. A serverless billing platform processes millions of payment commands with Lambda across multiple availability zones. A retried event must never create a second charge for the same payment. Which design provides the strongest protection against duplicate payment effects? Option A. Store payment commands in S3 and invoke a Lambda function from object-created notifications. Option B. Send commands to a standard SQS and let Lambda process each delivery. Option C. Write commands to DynamoDB and invoke Lambda directly from DynamoDB streams without an idempotency check. Option D. Send commands to an SQS FIFO queue with a stable payment ID as the deduplication ID, and make the Lambda consumer perform a conditional idempotency right before charging. The correct answer is D. Send commands to an SQS FIFO queue with a stable payment ID as the deduplication ID, and make the Lambda consumer perform a conditional idempotency right before charging. Here's why. SQS FIFO suppresses duplicate sends within its deduplication window and preserves ordering within a message group. The conditional idempotency record protects the payment side effect even if the Lambda event source retries a record. Why are the other options not correct? A. S3 notifications are not a payment command queue and can produce duplicate invocations. B. Standard SQS provides at least once delivery and can deliver duplicates. C. DynamoDB streams and Lambda can retry records. Without an idempotency guard, a repeated invocation can repeat the charge. Exam tip. For financial side effects, combine FIFO deduplication with an idempotent consumer. Question number 440. An organization that already used AWS Migration Hub before its 2025 availability change is planning a large data center migration. Architects need server configuration, utilization, and application dependency information from the on-premises environment in one migration planning view. Which solution should they use? Option A. Set a migration hub home region and collect the server inventory with Systems Manager. Option B. Set the migration hub home region and collect on-premises discovery data with AWS Application Discovery Service. Option C. Use AWS SCT for server templates and use Trusted Advisor to discover on-premises dependencies. Option D. Use AWS DMS and AWS SCT to inventory all non-database workloads. The correct answer is B. Set the migration hub home region and collect on-premises discovery data with AWS Application Discovery Service. Here's why. For an existing eligible customer, Application Discovery Service collects configuration, performance, and dependency data from on-premises servers, and Migration Hub presents that discovery information in the selected home region. Why are the other options not correct? A. Systems Manager manages connected nodes, but is not the dedicated migration discovery and dependency service described. C. AWS SCT converts database schemas, while Trusted Advisor does not inventory on-premises application dependencies. D. AWS DMS migrates databases and does not provide general server and workload discovery. Exam tip. Use migration discovery tooling to inventory utilization and dependencies before wave planning. Question number 441. A company has an AWS organization with all features enabled. It needs a centralized audit logging for sign-ins and API activity in every existing and newly created account. Security staff also need organization-wide visibility into compliance with the AWS Foundational Security Best Practices Standard. The company wants a managed, low-cost approach. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Deploy an AWS Control Tower landing zone from the organization's management account. Use Account Factory for governed accounts, and enable AWS Security Hub centrally. Option B. Deploy AWS Control Tower from a regular member account and enable Account Factory and Security Hub there. Option C. Use AMS Accelerate to build a landing zone and enable guard duty through a managed RFC process. Option D. Use AMS Accelerate to build a landing zone and request Security Hub provisioning through RFCs. The correct answer is A. Deploy an AWS Control Tower landing zone from the organization's management account. Use Account Factory for governed accounts, and enable AWS Security Hub centrally. Here's why. Control Tower is established from the management account and provides governed account enrollment, centralized logging, and Account Factory. Security Hub can centrally assess accounts against the FSBP standard. Why are the other options not correct? B. The landing zone is created from the organization's management account, not an arbitrary member account. C. Guard duty detects threats, but does not provide FSBP compliance assessment. D. AMS Accelerate adds managed service cost and process overhead when Control Tower and Security Hub directly meet the requirements. Exam tip. Use Control Tower for managed multi-account governance and Security Hub for security standard compliance. Question number 442. An engineering team stores 10 terabytes of Apache Parquet telemetry in Amazon S3. Analysts run SQL against the files only a few times each month. The team does not want to maintain database or cluster capacity between queries. Which design is most cost-effective? Option A. Load the files into Aurora MySQL with AWS DMS and query the database. Option B. Maintain a Redshift cluster and use Redshift Spectrum for the S3 files. Option C. Run an AWS Glue crawler to catalog the dataset and query the Parquet files directly with Amazon Athena. Option D. Provision an Amazon EMR cluster and submit Spark SQL jobs. The correct answer is C. Run an AWS Glue crawler to catalog the dataset and query the Parquet files directly with Amazon Athena. Here's why. A Glue crawler can create the table metadata, while Athena provides serverless SQL directly over Parquet in S3. The company pays for query scanning instead of continuously running compute. Why are the other options not correct? A. Aurora requires database storage and instance capacity and adds an unnecessary migration. B. A provisioned Redshift cluster incurs ongoing cost for infrequent analysis. D. EMR adds cluster provisioning and administration for occasional SQL queries. Exam tip. Use Glue Data Catalog and Athena for intermittent SQL analysis of structured data in Amazon S3. Question number 443. An organization governed by a AWS Control Tower must reject CloudFormation deployments before they create either an EC2 instance with a public IP address or an IAM resource containing an inline wildcard policy. Post-deployment detection is not sufficient. Which control should the company use? Option A. Enable Control Tower detective controls and remediate violations after provisioning. Option B. Enable the relevant AWS Control Tower proactive controls for CloudFormation resources. Option C. Use AWS config rules and delete non-compliant resources with Systems Manager after deployment. Option D. Use only SCPs to inspect the full CloudFormation template and reject non-compliant resource properties. The correct answer is B. Enable the relevant AWS Control Tower proactive controls for CloudFormation resources. Here's why. Proactive controls evaluate supported CloudFormation resources before provisioning and can stop a stack operation when the proposed configuration violates the policy. Why are the other options not correct? A. Detective controls report non-compliance after resources exist and do not prevent creation. C. Detection followed by deletion occurs after deployment and introduces a period of exposure. D. SCPs restrict API actions but do not generally evaluate complete CloudFormation resource property combinations. Exam tip. Use proactive controls when infrastructure as code must be rejected before non-compliant resources are created. Question number 444. A legacy web application runs on one EC2 instance in one public subnet. Traffic has outgrown the instance, but the company cannot rewrite the application. The revised architecture must provide horizontal scaling and remain available if an availability zone fails. Which two changes meet the requirements? Option A. Replace the instance with a larger compute-optimized instance. Option B. Deploy a NAT gateway to accept incoming website traffic. Option C. Create an EC2 auto-scaling group that spans private subnets in multiple availability zones. Option D. Replace the instance with a larger memory-optimized instance. E. Place an internet-facing application load balancer in public subnets and register the auto-scaling targets. The correct answer is C. Create an EC2 auto-scaling group that spans private subnets in multiple availability zones. E. Place an internet-facing application load balancer in public subnets and register the auto-scaling targets. Here's why. The auto-scaling group supplies replaceable application instances across multiple failure domains. The public ALB distributes client requests to healthy instances in the private subnets. Why are the other options not correct? A. Vertical scaling leaves a single instance and a single point of failure. B. A NAT gateway provides outbound translation for private resources and does not distribute inbound web traffic. D. A larger memory footprint does not provide horizontal scaling or multi-availability zone resilience. Exam tip. A highly available EC2 web tier uses multi-availability zone auto-scaling behind an internet-facing load balancer. Question number 445. Developers can view the configuration of several AWS Lambda functions, but selected environment variable values must remain unreadable to them in the console. The functions still need to decrypt the values during execution. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use a customer-managed AWS KMS key and Lambda environment variable encryption helpers for the sensitive values. Option B. Move the functions to EC2 and store the same values in instance user data. Option C. Use AWS Cloud HSM with SSL settings on each Lambda function. Option D. Issue an ACM certificate and use the certificate to encrypt Lambda configuration values. The correct answer is A. Use a customer-managed AWS KMS key and Lambda environment variable encryption helpers for the sensitive values. Here's why. Lambda encryption helpers support client-side encryption of selected environment variables with a customer-managed KMS key. Runtime permissions can allow the function to decrypt while console users lack permission to view plaintext. Why are the other options not correct? B. Moving to EC2 increases infrastructure management and does not inherently secure the values. C. Cloud HSM and SSL are not the native Lambda environment variable encryption mechanism. D. ACM manages TLS certificates and is not used to encrypt Lambda environment variables. Exam tip. Use KMS-backed client-side encryption when console viewers must not see sensitive Lambda environment values. Question number 446. A public analytics application will expose REST endpoints through Amazon API Gateway to millions of registered customers. The company needs a managed user directory and token validation without maintaining custom authentication code. Which architecture is most operationally efficient? Option A. Create IAM users for customers and authorize an API Gateway HTTP API with IAM. Option B. Use a Cognito identity pool as the user directory and configure a Cognito authorizer for an HTTP API. Option C. Build a Lambda authentication service and use a Lambda authorizer on a REST API. Option D. Use an Amazon Cognito user pool and configure a Cognito user pool authorizer on the API Gateway REST API. The correct answer is D. Use an Amazon Cognito user pool and configure a Cognito user pool authorizer on the API Gateway REST API. Here's why. A Cognito user pool provides scalable end-user registration and authentication. API Gateway can validate the resulting tokens through its native user pool authorizer, eliminating a custom authentication service. Why are the other options not correct? A. IAM users are inappropriate for a large public customer population. B. Identity pools primarily vend temporary AWS credentials and are not the primary managed user directory in this design. C. A Lambda authorizer requires custom authentication code and ongoing maintenance. Exam tip. Use Cognito user pools for application users and native API Gateway authorizers for token validation. Question number 447. Administrators must be notified by email whenever someone schedules deletion of a customer-managed AWS KMS key. The company also wants the pending deletion canceled automatically during the waiting period with minimal custom code. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Use CloudTrail log delivery and a CloudWatch alarm that publishes to SNS without remediation. Option B. Match the schedule key deletion API event with EventBridge. Invoke the AWS Config Remediation Cancel Key Deletion Systems Manager Automation Runbook and publish to an SNS topic. Option C. Invoke an AWS config rule directly as an EventBridge target to cancel the key deletion. Option D. Build a custom Lambda remediation function, a separate CloudWatch alarm, and multiple EventBridge targets. The correct answer is B. Match the schedule key deletion API event with EventBridge. Invoke the AWS Config Remediation Cancel Key Deletion Systems Manager Automation Runbook and publish to an SNS topic. Here's why. EventBridge can match the CloudTrail event for schedule key deletion, trigger the AWS Managed Cancellation Runbook, and notify administrators through SNS. This provides automated remediation without custom function code. Why are the other options not correct? A. The alarm can notify administrators but does not cancel the scheduled deletion. C. An AWS config rule is not directly invoked as an EventBridge remediation target in the proposed manner. D. Custom Lambda and additional monitoring components create avoidable development and maintenance. Exam tip. Detect schedule key deletion and invoke the Managed Cancellation Runbook before the waiting period expires. Question number 448. A custom reporting program is used heavily during the final week of each month and rarely at other times. One report always completes in under 10 minutes, and users want execution to begin immediately when requested. The company wants the lowest cost compute model. Which solution should be used? Option A. Keep on-demand EC2 instances running throughout the final week and start jobs with EventBridge. Option B. Run the program as an ECS service that remains available for report requests. Option C. Package the program as an AWS Lambda function and invoke it on demand through EventBridge. Option D. Keep spot instances running throughout the final week and start jobs with EventBridge. The correct answer is C. Package the program as an AWS Lambda function and invoke it on demand through EventBridge. Here's why. The workload fits within Lambda's execution duration limit and is invoked infrequently. Lambda starts on demand, scales without server management, and charges only while reports run. Why are the other options not correct? A. Continuously running EC2 capacity creates idle cost between report requests. B. ECS can execute the program, but requires more service and compute configuration than this short event-driven task. D. Spot capacity can be interrupted and still incurs instance cost while kept running. Exam tip. Use Lambda for infrequent, event-driven tasks that complete within its execution limit. Question number 449. A research team is building a tightly coupled HPC cluster on Amazon EC2. The workload requires low-latency node-to-node communication and a high-throughput parallel scratch file system. Which two technologies should the solutions architect select? Option A. Create an Amazon FSx for Lustre file system using a scratch deployment type. Option B. Use CloudFront with both HTTP and HTTPS viewer protocols. Option C. Deploy the cluster through Elastic Beanstalk. Option D. Attach Elastic Fabric adapters to the EC2 instances. E. Create a custom routing accelerator in AWS Global Accelerator. The correct answer is A. Create an Amazon FSx for Lustre file system using a scratch deployment type. D. Attach Elastic Fabric adapters to the EC2 instances. Here's why. FSx for Lustre provides parallel high-throughput scratch storage, while EFA supplies low-latency, high-bandwidth communication for tightly coupled compute nodes. Why are the other options not correct? B. CloudFront is a content delivery network and does not provide HPC storage or internode networking. C. Elastic Beanstalk is a web application platform, not an HPC optimization layer. E. Global Accelerator optimizes client traffic to endpoints rather than communication among cluster nodes. Exam tip. For tightly coupled HPC, combine EFA networking with FSx for Lustre parallel storage. Question number 450. A photo sharing application must screen newly uploaded images for inappropriate content before publishing them. The company wants to use a pre-trained AWS capability and does not want to collect a training dataset or build an ML model. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Train a custom classifier with SageMaker Autopilot and deploy a real-time endpoint. Option B. Invoke Amazon Recognition image moderation from an AWS Lambda function when the application submits a photo. Option C. Run Amazon Comprehend from a CloudFront function to classify image content. Option D. Use Amazon Recognition video from Lambda to analyze each still image. The correct answer is B. Invoke Amazon Recognition image moderation from an AWS Lambda function when the application submits a photo. Here's why. Amazon Recognition provides pre-trained image moderation labels through a managed API. Lambda can invoke the API for each upload without model development or training. Why are the other options not correct? A. SageMaker Autopilot trains a custom model, which violates the requirement. C. Amazon Comprehend analyzes text, and CloudFront functions cannot perform this image moderation task. D. Recognition video is intended for video analysis rather than individual photographs. Exam tip. Use recognition image moderation labels when unwanted image content must be detected without training a model. Question number 451. A digital marketplace depends on a single AWS account for revenue-generating workloads. The security team has protected the AWS account root user with MFA and wants a recovery measure that preserves access to root-only functions if the primary authenticator is lost or damaged. Which action should the team take? Option A. Create a second IAM administrator that can perform every root user operation during an emergency. Option B. Grant the administrator access policy to an existing IAM user after root user access is unavailable. Option C. Wait until the primary MFA device is lost, and then create another administrator identity. Option D. Register additional MFA devices with the AWS account root user and store at least one backup device securely. The correct answer is D. Register additional MFA devices with the AWS account root user and store at least one backup device securely. Here's why. AWS permits multiple MFA devices to be associated with the root user. Any registered device can satisfy MFA during sign-in, so a securely stored backup reduces the risk of an authentication lockout. Why are the other options not correct? A. IAM administrators still cannot perform the small set of tasks that require the root user. B. Administrator access affects permissions for an IAM identity. It does not restore root user authentication. C. Creating another identity requires access that might no longer be available after the lockout. Exam tip: protect the root user with more than one registered MFA device and keep a backup authenticator in a secure location. Question number 452. A fitness platform awards credits whenever members upload verified activity videos. Each participating retailer exposes an HTTPS endpoint and must receive the member identifier whenever credits are issued. New retailers are added frequently, and the application team does not want to change publisher code for every new destination. Which architecture requires the least implementation effort? Option A: publish each credit event to an Amazon SNS topic and add every retailer endpoint as an HTTP or HTTPS subscription. Option B: create one AWS step functions task for each retailer and update the state machine whenever a retailer joins. Option C: put retailer details and credit events into Kinesis data streams and build custom consumers for delivery. Option D: store retailer endpoints in Amazon TimeStream and invoke a Lambda function that loops through the list for every event. The correct answer is A: publish each credit event to an Amazon SNS topic and add every retailer endpoint as an HTTP or HTTPS subscription. Here's why. Amazon SNS provides managed fanout to many HTTP or HTTPS subscribers. Adding a retailer is primarily a subscription operation and does not require changing the application that publishes the event. Why are the other options not correct? B: a workflow task per retailer creates continuing maintenance as the partner population changes. C: Kinesis is designed for streaming consumers and would require custom delivery applications. D: this design requires custom endpoint discovery, retry handling, scaling, and delivery tracking. Exam tip: use SNS when one publisher must push the same event to many independently managed endpoints. Question number 453. A research organization has created IAM users for 6 cloud administrators. All 6 users need unrestricted access to AWS services and resources in one account, and the permissions should be managed centrally through an IAM user group. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A: attach administrator access as a resource-based policy to the IAM group and add the users. Option B: attach system administrator as a resource-based policy to the IAM group and add the users. Option C: attach the AWS managed administrator access identity-based policy to the IAM group and add all 6 IAM users to the group. Option D: attach the system administrator identity-based policy to the group and add all 6 IAM users. The correct answer is C: attach the AWS Managed Administrator Access Identity-Based Policy to the IAM group and add all 6 IAM users to the group. Here's why. Administrator access is an AWS Managed Identity-Based Policy that grants full access. Attaching it to the group applies the same permissions to every member. Why are the other options not correct? A: administrator access is identity-based, and IAM groups do not use resource-based policies. B: IAM groups cannot have resource-based policies, and system administrator is not equivalent to full administrative access. D: system administrator does not provide unrestricted access to every AWS service and resource. Exam tip: use identity-based policies on IAM groups to assign a common permission set to multiple IAM users. Question number 454. A manufacturing controller runs on one EC2 instance and cannot be redesigned or operated on multiple instances. The business wants the instance to return to service quickly after an underlying host failure while retaining its identity and attached EBS storage. What should a solutions architect configure? Option A: stripe 2 EBS volumes with RAID to provide instance recovery. Option B: enable termination protection on the instance. Option C: configure the single EC2 instance as a multi-availability zone deployment. Option D: create a CloudWatch alarm on the system status check and configure the alarm to recover the EC2 instance. The correct answer is D: create a CloudWatch alarm on the system status check and configure the alarm to recover the EC2 instance. Here's why. A CloudWatch recover action can move an impaired supported instance to healthy hardware while retaining instance metadata, private addresses, and attached EBS volumes. Why are the other options not correct? A. RAID affects storage layout and cannot recover the compute instance from an underlying host failure. B. Termination protection prevents accidental termination but does not remediate host impairment. C. Multi-availability zone is not a deployment property of an individual EC2 instance. Exam tip. Use EC2 recovery actions for irreplaceable single-instance workloads that cannot scale horizontally. Question number 455. An insurance application uses a multi-availability zone Amazon RDS database. A periodic analytics query scans recently created records and causes latency for the transaction processing application. The company wants to isolate this read workload with minimal cost and operational effort. Which solution should be used? Option A. Modify the process to discover the database node with the fewest connections and query that node. Option B. Have developers export the new records manually at the end of each business day. Option C. Cache the analytics query results in Amazon Elastic Cache and continue running the scan on the primary. Option D. Create an RDS read replica and direct the analytics process to the replica endpoint. The correct answer is D. Create an RDS read replica and direct the analytics process to the replica endpoint. Here's why. A read replica provides a separate read endpoint for reporting queries, reducing load on the primary database without requiring a self-managed reporting system. Why are the other options not correct? A. A conventional multi-availability zone standby is not an application-readable target and connection-based node selection is not appropriate. B. Manual exports increase administration and delay access to results. C. Caching may help repeated lookups, but does not isolate the reporting scan from the primary database. Exam tip. Use RDS read replicas to offload reporting and other read-heavy workloads from the primary. Question number 456. A ticketing service invokes many Lambda functions during unpredictable sales spikes. The functions connect to a private RDS for PostgreSQL instance, and the database is reaching its connection limit even though query volume remains manageable. Which design will stabilize database connections? Option A. Place the Lambda functions in the VPC and configure them to connect through an RDS proxy endpoint. Option B. Keep the functions outside the VPC and direct them to an RDS custom endpoint. Option C. Place the functions in the VPC and direct them to an RDS custom endpoint. Option D. Keep the Lambda functions outside the VPC and connect them to an RDS proxy endpoint. The correct answer is A. Place the Lambda functions in the VPC and configure them to connect through an RDS proxy endpoint. Here's why. RDS proxy pools and reuses database connections, which protects the database from Lambda concurrency spikes. VPC connectivity is required for the functions to reach the private proxy and database. Why are the other options not correct? B. This option neither provides the private network path nor solves connection exhaustion. C. A custom endpoint is associated with Aurora routing and does not provide connection pooling for this RDS workload. D. A function without the required VPC path cannot directly reach the private proxy endpoint. Exam tip. Use RDS proxy to pool relational database connections for highly concurrent serverless workloads. Question number 457. An enterprise must let employees sign in to the AWS Management Console by using an existing on-premises LDAP directory. The directory cannot issue SAML assertions, and the company does not want to create long-term IAM credentials for every employee. Which approach meets the requirement? Option A. Embed an IAM permissions policy in the LDAP directory and use it for authentication. Option B. Build an on-premises identity broker that authenticates against LDAP and requests temporary credentials from AWS STS. Option C. Connect the LDAP directory directly to IAM Identity Center without a supported federation protocol. Option D. Synchronize IAM access keys whenever an employee changes an LDAP password. The correct answer is B. Build an on-premises identity broker that authenticates against LDAP and requests temporary credentials from AWS STS. Here's why. A custom broker can validate the user against LDAP, call AWS STS for temporary federated credentials, and generate a console sign-in session without requiring SAML support. Why are the other options not correct? A. IAM policies control authorization and do not authenticate LDAP users. C. IAM Identity Center requires a supported identity source or federation integration. Arbitrary LDAP cannot be connected directly this way. D. Synchronizing long-term AWS credentials is insecure and creates substantial operational overhead. Exam tip. Use an STS-based custom identity broker when a legacy directory cannot participate in standard federation. Question number 458. A claims processing platform consists of asynchronous application tiers. The replacement architecture must minimize infrastructure administration and preserve ordered, duplicate-suppressed messaging between tiers. Which two components should the company choose? Option A. Run the compute tiers on a self-managed fleet of EC2 instances. Option B. Use Amazon SQS FIFO queues between the compute tiers. Option C. Run the compute tiers on Amazon EKS clusters with managed node groups. Option D. Use standard Amazon SNS topics as the only messaging layer between tiers. E. Run the compute tiers as AWS Lambda functions. The correct answer is B. Use Amazon SQS FIFO queues between the compute tiers. E. Run the compute tiers as AWS Lambda functions. Here's why. Lambda removes server management for the processing tiers. SQS FIFO queues preserve message group order and provide deduplication semantics that support exactly once processing within the service model. Why are the other options not correct? A. EC2 requires capacity planning, patching, scaling, and availability management. C. EKS introduces Kubernetes and node capacity administration compared with Lambda. D. A standard SNS topic does not provide FIFO ordering and queue-level deduplication. Exam tip. Combine serverless compute with SQS FIFO when asynchronous processing requires ordering and deduplication. Question number 459. EC2 instances in private subnets analyze confidential documents stored in Amazon S3. The security team requires S3 traffic to remain on the AWS network and wants the bucket to reject requests that do not use the approved private path. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Route S3 requests through a NAT gateway and grant the instance's read and write permissions. Option B. Create long-term access keys for the application and store them on the instances. Option C. Attach an IAM policy that grants S3 access, but leave the application using the public S3 endpoint. Option D. Create an S3 gateway VPC endpoint and restrict the bucket policy to requests from that endpoint. The correct answer is D. Create an S3 gateway VPC endpoint and restrict the bucket policy to requests from that endpoint. Here's why. The gateway endpoint provides private connectivity from the VPC to S3. A bucket policy condition can restrict data access to the approved endpoint. Why are the other options not correct? A. A NAT gateway reaches public service endpoints and adds processing cost. It does not enforce endpoint-only access. B. Long-term credentials increase risk and do not create a private network path. C. IAM permissions authorize actions, but do not ensure that traffic uses private connectivity. Exam tip. Use an S3 gateway endpoint plus an endpoint-restricted bucket policy for private, controlled S3 access. Question number 460. A meal planning service receives unstructured recipe text in an S3 bucket. It must extract key phrases and standard entities from the text and write the extracted values to DynamoDB. The team has no machine learning specialists, can tolerate occasional non-recipe files, and wants the lowest cost managed approach. Which solution is the best fit? Option A. Deploy a custom SageMaker inference endpoint and invoke it for every uploaded object. Option B. Use an S3 object-created notification to invoke Lambda. Call Amazon Comprehend to extract entities and key phrases and store the results in DynamoDB. Option C. Convert each recipe to speech with Amazon Polly and ask employees to listen and enter data manually. Option D. Invoke Lambda through EventBridge and use Amazon Forecast to identify key phrases. The correct answer is B. Use an S3 object-created notification to invoke Lambda, call Amazon Comprehend to extract entities and key phrases, and store the results in DynamoDB. Here's why. Amazon Comprehend offers managed natural language analysis without requiring the team to operate an ML endpoint. Combined with S3 events and Lambda, it creates a low administration, pay-per-use pipeline. Why are the other options not correct? A. A SageMaker endpoint would require model development or selection and ongoing endpoint administration. C. Polly only synthesizes speech, and this workflow adds manual labor. D. Amazon Forecast is for time series prediction, not entity or key phrase extraction from text. Exam tip. Use managed NLP services for general text extraction. Use custom models when domain-specific accuracy is mandatory. Question number 461. A media company runs a Lambda function inside a VPC in account A. The function must mount a growing EFS file system whose mount targets are an AVPC owned by account B. The company wants to avoid creating and synchronizing a second copy of the file system. Which solution is most cost-effective? Option A. Establish VPC peering between the two VPCs and configure the required routes and EFS access controls. Option B. Invoke a second Lambda function in account B and return file contents through function responses. Option C. Package the file collection in a cross-account Lambda layer. Option D. Create another EFS file system in account A and continuously copy data with AWS data sync. The correct answer is A. Establish VPC peering between the two VPCs and configure the required routes and EFS access controls. Here's why. VPC peering provides private routing between the Lambda subnets and the EFS mount targets. EFS remains the shared scalable store without duplicate capacity or synchronization jobs. Why are the other options not correct? B. Function chaining does not provide the first function with a mounted shared file system and adds an application hop. C. Lambda layers are size-limited deployment artifacts, not elastic shared storage. D. A second file system adds storage cost and requires ongoing synchronization. Exam tip. Use private VPC connectivity and appropriate EFS policies when compute must mount a cross-account file system. Question number 462. A regulated firm will archive confidential files in Amazon S3. The organization must retain complete custody of encryption keys outside AWS while protecting data during transfer and while stored. Which design satisfies the requirement? Option A. Rely on the bucket's default server-side encryption settings. Option B. Encrypt each file in the on-premises environment with externally managed keys and upload the ciphertext to S3 over HTTPS. Option C. Use SSE-KMS with a customer-managed KMS key. Option D. Use SSE-KMS with an AWS-managed KMS key. The correct answer is B. Encrypt each file in the on-premises environment with externally managed keys and upload the ciphertext to S3 over HTTPS. Here's why. Client-side encryption performed before upload keeps key generation and use outside AWS. HTTPS protects the ciphertext in transit, and S3 stores only encrypted objects. Why are the other options not correct? A. Default S3 encryption uses key management within AWS and does not provide external key custody. C. A customer-managed KMS key offers customer control but is still hosted and used by AWS KMS. D. The encryption key remains managed within AWS KMS. Exam tip. Choose client-side encryption when keys must remain entirely outside the AWS cloud. You have completed Part 13 of the SAA-C03 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.